is your leader? Speak now or be silent forever.
It is him. I saw him praying to their god.
Seize them!
Even in these shadows, the light of Christ endures.
Hear me, you who stand in judgment.
They dragged him through the streets like a criminal, but there was something about him that didn't match the chaos surrounding him. No fear in his eyes, no trembling in his steps, just a quiet, unshakable calm that unsettled even the soldiers. Gripping his arms, the crowd had already gathered, thousands of eyes, some curious, some hungry for spectacle, others filled with something darker, hatred, fueled by rumors of a man who refused to bow, a man who spoke of a kingdom that no emperor could control. At the center of it all stood the execution device. A massive vat. Beneath it, flames roared. The fire crackled violently, licking the metal with relentless heat until the contents inside began to bubble, then churn, then rage. Thick oil rolled and spat like a living thing, releasing waves of heat so intense that even those standing at a distance instinctively stepped back. This wasn't just an execution. This was meant to be a message, a warning. Rome did not tolerate defiance. And yet the man they brought forward did not look defeated. This was John, one of the last remaining followers of Jesus. Long before the flames, before the empire, before the moment that would leave thousands speechless, John was just a man, not a legend, not a mystery. Just a fisherman. He spent his early days by the sea, casting nets into unpredictable waters, living a life shaped by routine, survival, and quiet endurance. A man who had already witnessed crucifixion, seen fear, persecution, and the collapse of everything he once knew. And under Emperor Domitian, that fear was carefully crafted. Domitian did not rule like a distant leader. He ruled like a man obsessed with authority, a ruler who demanded not just obedience, but worship. He declared himself more than an emperor. He declared himself divine, and in a world where emperors could be gods, refusal was not seen as disagreement. Itamo was seen as rebellion, and the punishment was for dominance and public statement. John was a man who had seen fear and outlived it. But this was different. No one survived boiling oil. Not for seconds. And yet as the guards forced him closer, something strange began to happen. The noise of the crowd started to fade, not because it actually grew quiet, but because something about John's presence disrupted the moment. His calm didn't make sense. It didn't belong here. It clashed with the violence of what was about to happen. Some in the crowd shifted uneasily. Others leaned forward, because deep down, everyone understood what they were about to witness. A slow death. A horrifying death. The kind that made people scream, the kind that silenced even the strongest. The soldiers hesitated for a brief second, but orders were orders. The emperor was watching. This had to be done. They lifted him. The heat intensified instantly, wrapping around his body like a suffocating force. The air itself burned. Breathing became a struggle for those nearby. The oil roared louder now, bubbles bursting at the surface like violent eruptions, and then they dropped him. The moment should have been immediate. Screams, thrashing, agony, but none of that came. Instead, something impossible unfolded. The oil continued to boil. The fire continued to rage. But John remained still, not lifeless, not destroyed, alive, standing, unharmed. At first, the crowd didn't understand what they were seeing. Their minds tried to force logic into place. Perhaps it was an illusion. Perhaps it hadn't been long enough. The soldiers stepped back. One of them dropped his weapon. The same fire that should have consumed him now illuminated him, revealing something that made even the strongest hearts falter. John was speaking. Words. Calm. Steady. In the middle of boiling oil, he was preaching. The impossible had become undeniable. Panic began to ripple through the crowd. Not loud panic, but the kind that crawls under the skin. The kind that makes people question everything they thought they knew. Some turned away, unable to process it. Others fell silent, frozen in place. And a few began to feel something they hadn't expected: fear, not of the man in the oil, but of the power that was keeping him alive. Because if Rome couldn't kill him, then what did that say about the one he believed in? High above, watching it all unfold, the emperor felt it too. This execution was supposed to prove dominance. Instead, it was exposing a weakness. And in that moment, surrounded by fire, oil, and thousands of witnesses, the balance of power began to shift. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. The moment had slipped beyond human control, and whatever happened next would no longer belong to Rome. It belonged to someone far greater. Someone unseen had just rewritten the rules of life and death before their very eyes. And deep within the silence, the emperor started plotting again. Banishment, exile was meant to silence him. That was the purpose. Not just to remove him from the crowds, but to erase his influence, to bury his voice in a place where it could no longer reach the ears of those who had begun to listen. So they chose a place that felt like the end of the world: Patmos. Yet even there, he was not subdued. What John saw was not meant to comfort. It was meant to reveal, because the visions that came to him on that isolated island were not gentle. They were not simple. They were not easy to understand or easy to accept. They were overwhelming, layered, symbolic. Long before the flames, before the empire, before the moment that would leave thousands speechless, John was just a man, not a legend, not a mystery, just a fisherman. He spent his early days by the sea, casting nets into unpredictable waters, living a life shaped by routine, survival, and quiet endurance. The rhythm of the waves was all he knew. The uncertainty of the catch defined his future. There was nothing in his life that suggested he would one day stand at the center of one of the most unexplainable moments in history. And yet, everything changed with a single call, a voice that cut through the ordinary, a man who saw something in him that no one else had ever seen. Jesus. John didn't just follow him. He stayed close. Closer than most. He became known as the disciple whom Jesus loved, not because he was better, but because he understood something deeper. While others asked questions, John observed. While others doubted, John remained. There was a quiet intensity about him, a hunger not just to see miracles, but to understand the heart behind them. He was there in moments others would never forget. He saw water turned into wine. He witnessed storms silenced with a word. He stood in crowds where thousands were fed from almost nothing, but more importantly, he saw the emotion behind it all. Compassion, power, authority, love. John wasn't just watching events unfold, he was absorbing meaning, and that would change everything. Because when the moment came that shattered everyone else, John stayed. When fear spread like wildfire, John stood firm. When the cross rose against the sky, John did not run. He stood there, watching, hearing every word, feeling every second. While others hid, John remained close enough to hear Jesus speak his final instructions, even entrusting him with the care of his mother. That moment alone would mark him forever. Because John didn't just witness the death of his teacher, he witnessed what looked like the end of everything he believed in. And yet, it wasn't the end. 3 days later, everything changed again. The resurrection didn't just restore hope, it ignited something unstoppable. Fear turned into boldness, silence turned into proclamation. And John, once a quiet observer, became a voice. Not loud, not aggressive, but unshakably certain He began to preach about what he had seen, not stories, not theories, reality. He spoke of a risen Christ, of a kingdom not built by human hands, of a truth that couldn't be silenced by threats or violence, and that made him dangerous, because Rome could tolerate many things, different beliefs, different customs, even different gods. But what Rome could not tolerate was allegiance to something greater than itself. And John's message did exactly that. It challenged power. It exposed fear. It inspired people to look beyond the empire, and that was something no ruler could allow. As the years passed, the world around John grew darker. Persecution intensified. Followers of Jesus were hunted, some imprisoned, some executed, others forced into hiding. One by one, the voices that once stood beside him began to disappear. Peter, gone. James, gone. Many others, silenced, and yet John remained, older now, wiser, but not quieter. If anything, his voice carried more weight than ever before, because he wasn't speaking from belief alone anymore. He was speaking from survival, from experience, from a lifetime of watching truth endure against impossible odds, and that made him something Rome had never faced before, a man they couldn't intimidate, a man who had already outlived fear, a man who had seen death and knew it didn't have the final word. So when word of John reached the ears of the emperor, it didn't sound like just another preacher. It sounded like a problem, a growing influence, a voice that refused to fade. And in a system built on control, that kind of voice could not be ignored. Because if people started listening, if they started believing, if they began to realize that Rome's power had limits, then everything could begin to unravel. And so, quietly at first, then with growing urgency, a decision was made. John would be stopped, not debated, not reasoned with. Stopped. Because Rome didn't fear armies as much as it feared ideas, and John carried one idea that refused to die, an idea that had already survived crucifixion, an idea that had already defeated the grave, an idea that was now spreading through cities, homes, and hearts. And if that idea could not be silenced, then the man carrying it would have to be. But what Rome didn't understand was that John was no longer just a man. He was a witness, and some witnesses cannot be erased. They can only be tested, and Rome was about to discover exactly what that meant. Power in Rome was not just about strength. It was about control of armies, control of land, control of fear, but more than anything, control of belief. Because Rome understood something most empires eventually learn. The moment people stop fearing you, you begin to lose them. And under Emperor Domitian, that fear was carefully crafted. Domitian did not rule like a distant leader. He ruled like a man obsessed with authority, a ruler who demanded not just obedience, but worship. He declared himself more than an emperor. He declared himself divine. And in a world where emperors could be gods, refusal was not seen as disagreement, was seen as rebellion, dangerous rebellion. So when whispers began to spread about a growing movement, people gathering in secret, refusing to bow to Rome, declaring allegiance to someone they called Lord, Domitian paid attention, because there was only room for one Lord in Rome, and it wasn't the man they were preaching about. At first, the movement seemed small, insignificant, a scattered group of believers holding on to strange teachings about love, sacrifice, and a kingdom that couldn't be seen. But ideas have a way of growing, quietly, relentlessly, and before long, those whispers became voices. Those voices became gatherings, and those gatherings became a presence Rome could no longer ignore. Christians. They didn't fight with weapons. They didn't organize rebellions. They didn't march against the empire, and that made them even more dangerous. Because you couldn't crush them the way you crushed an army. They weren't trying to take Rome's power. They were simply ignoring it. And that was a threat far deeper than violence. Because if enough people stopped believing in Rome's authority, then Rome's authority would begin to disappear. So Domitian responded the only way he knew how, with force. Arrests began. Interrogations followed. Accusations spread quickly. Traitors, atheists, enemies of the state. Anyone who refused to worship the emperor was marked. Some were imprisoned. Some were tortured. Some were executed in ways designed not just to kill, but to terrify. Public spectacles became tools of control. Because fear, when displayed correctly, could silence thousands, and for a time, it worked. Many hid, many stayed quiet, many chose survival over faith. But not all. There were still voices that refused to disappear, and among them, one stood out more than the rest. John. He wasn't just another believer. He was one of the last living connections to the beginning of it all, a direct witness, a man who had walked with Jesus, and that made his words carry weight that others simply couldn't match. When John spoke, people listened, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried truth with a certainty that couldn't be shaken. He didn't speak like someone hoping he was right. He spoke like someone who had seen it, lived it, survived it, and in a time when fear was silencing so many, John's voice remained steady, uncompromising, and that made him dangerous in a way Domitian could not ignore. Because killing random believers might slow the spread, but silencing John, that could break the movement, or so Rome believed. Reports about him began to reach the emperor. Not just that he was preaching, but that people were changing because of him. That fear wasn't working on him. That threats didn't move him. That even as others disappeared, he continued, calm, unshaken, almost as if he knew something Rome didn't. And that unsettled Domitian, because rulers like him thrived on predictability. Fear should produce silence. Pain should produce surrender. Death should produce obedience. But John didn't follow those rules, and anything that refuses to follow the rules of power becomes a problem that must be eliminated. So the decision was made. Not quietly, not secretly, but deliberately. John would be brought to Rome, not just to be punished, but to be made an example, a public statement, a demonstration of what happens to anyone who challenges the authority of the empire, because Domitian didn't just want John gone, he wanted his influence destroyed. He wanted the people who followed him to watch, to see, to feel the weight of Rome's power, and to understand, without question, that resistance was meaningless. But there was something Domitian didn't realize, something he couldn't calculate, something no empire ever truly understands. You can control bodies. You can control actions. You can even control words for a time. But belief is different. Belief doesn't break the same way. And John's belief had already been tested far beyond what most men could endure. He had seen suffering. He had seen death. He had stood at the foot of the cross and watched hope collapse, only to see it rise again. And once someone has seen that, once someone has witnessed death lose its power, there is very little left in this world that can truly threaten them. So when the order came for John to be arrested, he did not run, he did not hide, he did not resist. Because this wasn't new to him. This was just another test, and somewhere deep within, he already understood something that Rome was about to learn the hard way. You cannot silence a man who no longer fears death. As soldiers were sent to seize him, as chains were prepared, as the machinery of the empire moved into place, the stage was being set, not just for an execution, but for a moment that would challenge everything Rome believed about power, because Domitian thought he was about to prove something. He thought he was about to show the world that no one could stand against him. But in reality, he was about to face something he could not control, something he could not understand, something that did not respond to fear. And as John was brought closer to Rome, closer to the emperor, closer to the fire that awaited him, the tension began to rise. Because this was no longer just about punishment. This was about a collision between earthly power and something far greater, and only one of them was about to be exposed as powerless. The day of the execution did not begin with noise. It began with anticipation, a strange, heavy anticipation that settled over the city like a storm waiting to break. Word had spread quickly, faster than Rome could control. People whispered about it in markets, in alleys, in homes. Not just another execution, something different, because this man was different. By the time the gates opened, the crowd was already forming, not forced, not summoned, drawn. Thousands poured into the arena, filling the stone seats, their voices blending into a restless hum. Some came for entertainment, others came out of curiosity, and a few came because they had heard the stories. Stories that didn't make sense. Stories about a man who could not be shaken. At the center of the arena stood the instrument of death, the vat. Enormous, cold, silent, for now. Beneath it, stacks of wood were carefully arranged, waiting to be lit. Guards moved with precision, checking every detail. This had to be perfect, because today was not just about death, it was about dominance. High above, the emperor watched, still, focused, certain. Domitian had seen countless executions. Pain did not disturb him. Death did not move him. But today, there was something else. Expectation. Because this was not just about killing a man. This was about breaking a message. The signal was given. Flames ignited. Slow at first, then growing, then roaring. The fire consumed the wood, climbing higher, feeding the metal above it. Heat began to rise in waves, distorting the air, bending the light itself. The vat, once silent, began to respond. A low sound, then a hiss, then movement. The oil inside started to stir. Small bubbles formed at the surface, then burst. Again and again, until the entire surface came alive, rolling violently, churning with a force that seemed almost alive. The sound alone was enough to unsettle the crowd. A deep, aggressive boiling that echoed through the arena, the kind of sound that promised suffering, that guaranteed it. And then he was brought out, chains on his wrists, guards at his sides. But still, that same calm. No resistance, no panic, no visible fear. John walked forward as if he were stepping into something familiar, not something fatal. His eyes did not scan the crowd. He did not look at the emperor. He did not even look at the vat. It was as if his focus was somewhere else entirely. And that disturbed people, because fear is expected. Fear is human. And when it's absent, something feels wrong. The crowd quieted. Not completely, but enough. Enough to feel the shift. This was the moment. The guards stopped at the edge of the vat. The heat was overwhelming now. Even they struggled to stand close. Sweat poured down their faces. Their grip tightened, not just on John, but on their own composure. One final chance. One final opportunity. The command was clear. Renounce or die. But John did not answer with fear. He answered with silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that speaks louder than words, the kind that says everything without needing to say anything. And that was enough. The order was given. The guards moved. They lifted him. The heat surged upward, wrapping around his body instantly. The air itself burned. The oil below raged violently, splashing against the edges, as if reacting to what was about to happen. For a split second, everything slowed. The crowd leaned forward, breath held, eyes locked. This was it. And then, they let go. His body dropped into the boiling oil. The reaction should have been immediate, violent, unavoidable, human. But instead, there was nothing. No scream, no thrashing, no desperate attempt to escape. Just stillness. At first, the mind rejects what it sees. The crowd waited, 1 second, 2, 3, expecting the inevitable, but it didn't come. The oil continued to boil, the fire continued to roar, but John remained, standing, inside the vat, unmoved, unburned, alive. A ripple passed through the arena. Confusion, then disbelief, then something deeper. Because this was no trick, no illusion. The heat was real, the fire was real, the oil was real. And yet, the man, inside it was untouched. The guards stepped back instinctively. One of them stumbled, nearly falling. Another stared, frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. The crowd began to shift, not loudly, but uneasily, like a wave building beneath the surface, because what they were witnessing was not just unexpected, it was impossible. And then John moved, not in panic, not in pain, but calmly, deliberately. He raised his head, and he began to speak. At first, the words were lost in the roar of the fire, but slowly, they became clear, steady, strong, unshaken. He was not crying out for help. He was not begging for mercy. He was preaching. In the middle of boiling oil, he was preaching. The sound carried across the arena, cutting through the chaos, reaching ears that had come expecting screams, and instead heard something entirely different. Truth, calm, authority. And that was the moment everything changed. Because fear no longer belonged to the man in the fire. It began to spread through the crowd. People looked at each other, searching for explanation, finding none. Some covered their mouths. Others stepped back, and a few fell completely silent, as if their minds had reached a limit they could not go beyond. High above, the emperor leaned forward, for the first time, uncertain, because this was not supposed to happen. This was not part of the plan. This was not controllable. The execution had turned into something else entirely, something dangerous, because power depends on perception, and in that moment, Rome no longer looked all-powerful. It looked powerless. The fire kept burning, the oil kept boiling, but the man inside it stood untouched, speaking with a calm that defied everything the empire believed about life, death, and control. And as the reality of what was happening settled over the arena, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer an execution. This was a confrontation between what Rome claimed to control and what it clearly could not. And the outcome was already beginning to show. Because the man who was supposed to die was standing in the fire, alive, unbroken, untouchable. And with every passing second, the certainty of Rome's power began to collapse under the weight of a miracle no one could deny. What began as a display of terror had become a revelation, and every eye in that arena now faced a question no empire could answer. If this man could stand untouched in the heart of death itself, then what power was truly at work here? What happened next was not what anyone expected, because Rome had prepared for a reaction. Screams, panic, submission. They had built this entire moment on certainty. The certainty that pain would break him, that death would silence him, that fear would spread through the crowd like fire. But now, none of that was happening. And that created something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. The arena, once filled with anticipation, had shifted into something unrecognizable. The noise that once echoed through the stone walls had faded into a low, uneasy murmur. People were no longer watching for entertainment. They were watching for understanding, trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. Because the human mind depends on patterns. Fire burns. Oil destroys. Bodies break. But here, in the eyes, center of the arena, those patterns had been shattered, and when patterns break, fear changes. It no longer comes from what we expect. It comes from what we cannot explain. The soldiers were the first to feel it, trained to enforce order, to execute commands without hesitation. They now stood frozen at the edge of the vat. Their discipline, once unshakable, began to crack under the weight of what they were witnessing. One stepped back, another avoided looking directly at the oil, because deep down, something inside them was resisting what their eyes were telling them. This was wrong. Not morally, but naturally. And when reality itself begins to feel unstable, even the strongest begin to falter. In the crowd, the reaction spread, not loudly, but deeply. A mother pulled her child closer. A man who had come to cheer now stood silent, his expression hollow. Others whispered, not in excitement, but in confusion, in fear, in disbelief. Because this was no longer about a man surviving. It was about something greater overriding the rules they had always trusted. And then, there were those who felt something else. Something they couldn't explain. Something they hadn't come expecting. Conviction. Because if what they were seeing was real, then everything John had been saying might also be real, and that thought was far more unsettling than the fire itself. High above, the Emperor felt the shift. He saw it in their faces. He heard it in the silence. This was not the reaction he wanted. This was not control. This was the beginning of doubt, and doubt was dangerous, because power is not maintained by force alone. It is maintained by perception, by belief. And in that moment, belief in Rome's absolute power was beginning to crack. Domitian's expression hardened. This had gone too far. What was meant to demonstrate authority was now undermining it. The longer this continued, the worse it would become. The man was still alive, still speaking, still influencing, even from within the flames, and that could not be allowed. The order was given. Quick, sharp, final, pull him out. The soldiers hesitated, only for a moment, but it was enough to reveal something had changed, because soldiers do not hesitate, not like this, not in front of the Emperor, but fear had reached them too. Still, they obeyed. Carefully. Cautiously. As if approaching something they no longer fully understood. They moved toward the vat, shielding themselves from the heat, reaching in with tools designed to retrieve what should have been a lifeless body. But what they pulled out was not what anyone expected. John emerged from the oil the same way he had entered it, alive, whole, untouched. Not a mark, not a wound, not even the slightest sign that he had just been submerged in something that should have destroyed him completely. The moment his feet touched the ground, a visible reaction passed through the crowd. Shock. Real, unfiltered. Because now there was no distance, no illusion, no possibility of misunderstanding. He was standing before them, unharmed. And suddenly, the question was no longer, how is this possible? It became, what does this mean? Because events like this demand interpretation. They force people to choose what they believe about what they've seen. Some looked away, unwilling to confront it. Others stared, unable to look away. And a few began to feel something shift inside them. Something deeper than fear. Something closer to realization. Because if Rome could not kill him, then Rome was not as powerful as they claimed. And if Rome was not all-powerful, then something else might be. Something greater. Something that had just revealed itself in the most undeniable way possible. The Emperor saw it happening. Not just the fear, but the change. The dangerous kind. The kind that spreads. The kind that cannot be easily reversed. And in that moment, Domitian understood something he had not anticipated. Killing John would not solve this, because death had just lost its power over him. Executing him again would not restore control. It would only reinforce what the people had already seen. So he chose something else, something calculated, something strategic. If he could not destroy the man, he would remove him, silence him, isolate him, take him away from the crowds, away from the influence, away from the growing belief that had just been ignited. The order changed, no longer execution, exile. John would be sent away, far from Rome, far from the people, far from the center of power, to a place where his voice could no longer spread, or so the emperor believed. But even as that decision was made, even as the soldiers prepared to take him away, there was something Domitian did not realize. Something no ruler can fully control. You can remove a man from a place, but you cannot remove the impact of what people have already seen. Because that moment, that impossible moment, had already planted something in the minds of thousands. A question, a doubt, a realization. And once those things take root, they do not disappear. They grow. And as John was led away from the arena, away from the fire that could not touch him, away from the empire that could not break him, the crowd did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They watched, in silence. Because they knew, whether they could explain it or not, they had just witnessed something that would not be forgotten. Something that would follow them long after they left those stone walls. Something that would continue to echo in their thoughts, in their conversations, in their beliefs. Because Rome had tried to make an example out of John, but instead, John had become something else entirely. A living question, a walking contradiction. Proof that there was a power greater than anything they had ever feared. And that realization was far more dangerous than any execution could ever be. Exile was meant to silence him. That was the purpose. Not just to remove him from the crowds, but to erase his influence. To bury his voice in a place where it could no longer reach the ears of those who had begun to listen. So they chose a place that felt like the end of the world. Patmos. A small, rugged island surrounded by endless water. Isolated, harsh, unforgiving. The kind of place where time itself seemed to slow down. Where the noise of civilization faded into nothing but wind, waves, and silence. It was not a place you were sent to live. It was a place you were sent to disappear. The journey there was quiet. No spectacle, no crowd, no audience, just soldiers. A prisoner, and the sound of the sea. John did not resist. He did not argue. He did not question. Because by now he understood something that Rome did not. This was not the end. This was another beginning. When they left him on the island, there were no final words, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of what had just happened in Rome, just abandonment. And then silence. Days passed, then more. Life on Patmos was not easy. The land was rough, the conditions unforgiving. The isolation was complete. There were no crowds to speak to, no communities to encourage, no visible impact to measure. For most people, this would have been the breaking point. Because isolation does something to the human mind. It strips away distraction. It amplifies thoughts. It forces you to confront everything you carry within you. Memories, pain, questions, doubt. And John had every reason to feel all of it. He had seen his fellow followers die. He had watched the world grow darker. He had faced death himself and survived in a way no one could explain. And now, after all of that, he was alone. Or at least, it appeared that way, because something unexpected began to happen. In the silence, in the stillness, in the isolation that was meant to destroy him, John began to experience something deeper than anything he had known before. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more real. Because when everything external is stripped away, what remains becomes undeniable. And for John, what remained was presence. Not the presence of people, not the presence of power, but something far beyond both. It didn't come through crowds. It didn't come through noise. It came through stillness, through moments that felt suspended in time, through awareness that went beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond anything physical. And slowly, that presence began to speak. Not in the way humans speak, but in a way that could not be misunderstood. Visions, clear, vivid, overwhelming. At first, they came like fragments, images that didn't fully connect, symbols that felt larger than explanation. But then, they began to form something greater, a message, a revelation, not just for John, but for the world. Because what he was being shown was not about his situation. It was about everything. The future, the unseen, the forces at work behind what people believed, was reality. He saw things no one else had seen. He saw struggle beyond human understanding. He saw judgment. He saw hope. He saw an ending and a beginning. And all of it came with a clarity that could not be ignored. The same man who had stood in boiling oil without fear was now standing in something even more overwhelming. Truth, unfiltered, undeniable. And this time, the fire was not around him. It was within the message itself. Because what he was receiving was not comfortable. It was not easy. It was powerful. And power, when revealed in its true form, changes everything. John began to write. Not casually, not creatively, but urgently. Because what he was seeing demanded to be recorded. Every detail mattered. Every symbol carried weight. Every word was part of something far greater than himself. This was not just reflection. This was transmission. From a place beyond human control to a world that desperately needed to understand what was coming. And as he wrote, something became clear. Rome had not silenced him. It had positioned him. Because the message he now carried would not have been possible in the noise of cities, in the chaos of crowds, in the distraction of constant movement. It required stillness. It required isolation. It required a place where nothing else could interfere. And Patmos provided exactly that. What was meant to be punishment had become purpose. What was meant to be silence had become revelation. And what was meant to end his influence was about to expand it beyond anything Rome could have imagined. Because words, written in isolation, carry a different kind of power. They are not shaped by audience. They are not softened by fear. They are not controlled by authority. They are raw, direct, unfiltered. And once they are released, they cannot be taken back. They cannot be contained. They cannot be erased. As John continued to write, the weight of what he was recording began to grow. This was not just for his time. This was for all time. A message that would outlive empires. Outlast. Rulers outreach every attempt to suppress it. And the irony was undeniable. The empire that tried to silence him had unknowingly created the conditions for his voice to become eternal. Because from a small, isolated island came one of the most powerful and mysterious writings the world would ever know. A message born not in comfort, but in exile. Not in safety, but in isolation. And as the waves crashed endlessly against the shores of Patmos, as the wind carried through the barren land, as the world moved on, unaware of what was being written, something extraordinary was taking place, not in the arena, not in the empire, but in silence, a revelation that would echo far beyond anything Rome could control. What John saw next was not meant to comfort, it was meant to reveal. Because the visions that came to him on that isolated island were not gentle. They were not simple. They were not easy to understand or easy to accept. They were overwhelming, layered, symbolic, terrifying, and yet filled with purpose. It began with a voice, not distant, not unclear, but powerful, so powerful it cut through everything else. A voice that did not ask for attention, but commanded it. A voice that carried authority beyond anything John had ever known. And when he turned to see where it came from, everything changed. Because what stood before him was not what he expected. Not the familiar image of the teacher he once walked beside, but something far greater, something glorified, radiant, uncontainable. The presence was overwhelming, beyond human description. It carried a weight that pressed against reality itself, as if heaven had broken through into the world he stood in, and in that moment, John did not stand. He fell, overcome. Because there are moments when the human mind cannot process what it is, seeing, and the only response left is surrender. But the vision did not stop there. It expanded. What John was shown next stretched far beyond a single moment, far beyond a single message. It unfolded like a series of revelations, each one building upon the last, each one revealing something deeper about the nature of reality itself. He saw kingdoms rise and fall. He saw power shift in ways no human ruler could control. He saw conflict, not just on earth, but beyond it. Forces clashing, light against darkness, truth against deception. He saw symbols that carried meaning far beyond their form. Seals being opened, trumpets sounding, events unfolding in sequences that felt both distant and immediate at the same time, and with each vision, the weight increased. Because this was not just information. This was unveiling, the revealing of what had always been hidden beneath the surface of the world. John was not being shown random images. He was being shown reality from a higher perspective. The kind of perspective that changes everything once you see it. He saw suffering, but he also saw justice. He saw destruction, but he also saw restoration. Because the message was not just about what would happen, it was about why. Why things unfold the way they do. Why power rises and collapses. Why truth is resisted and yet never fully destroyed. And at the center of it all, there was something constant, something unshaken, something eternal, a presence that did not change, no matter what chaos surrounded it. And that presence held authority over everything John was seeing. This was not a world out of control. It was a world moving toward something, a conclusion, a resolution. And as the visions continued, the intensity did not decrease, it increased. Because John was being taken further, deeper, beyond what most would ever be able to comprehend. He saw judgment, not as random destruction, but as a response to everything that had been hidden, everything that had been ignored, everything that had been allowed to grow unchecked. He saw the cost of deception, the consequences of power used wrongly, the collapse of systems that appeared unbreakable. And for anyone who had lived under Rome's authority, this would have carried a message that could not be ignored, because it revealed something simple and yet dangerous. No empire is permanent. No power is absolute. No system, no matter how strong it appears, can stand forever against what is true. And then the visions shifted from destruction to something else, something unexpected. Hope. Not weak hope, not wishful thinking, but certain hope. the kind that stands even after everything else has fallen. John saw restoration. He saw a future not defined by fear, not controlled by power, not shaped by suffering. He saw something new, a reality where everything broken had been made whole, where everything hidden had been revealed, where everything that once caused fear no longer had power. And that changed everything, because the message was no longer just about warning. It was about promise. A promise that no matter how dark things become, there is an ending already written, and it is not chaos, it is not destruction, it is completion. And as these visions came to an end, one thing became clear. John had not been spared in the fire for no reason. He had not been sent into exile by accident. He had been preserved for this, to see, to understand, to carry a message that could not be ignored, because what he wrote would outlive him. It would outlive Rome. It would outlive every empire, every ruler, every system that believed itself to be permanent, and that is exactly what made it so powerful. Because while Rome tried to demonstrate control through fear, this message revealed something greater, a reality where control does not belong to empires. It belongs to something eternal, something unchanging, something that had already proven its power, not just in visions, but in a man who stood in boiling oil and did not burn. And as John finished writing, as the final words were set down, as the visions settled into silence once again, the weight of what had been revealed remained, because this was not just a message for his time. It was a message for every time, a reminder, a warning, a promise, that what we see is not all there is, and what appears powerful is not always what truly is. What happened to John was never just about survival. It was about revelation. A man thrown into fire, who did not burn. A voice the empire tried to silence that only grew louder. A life that was meant to end, but instead became a message that would echo across generations. And that forces a question, not about history, but about you. Because if power, fear, and death could not break him, what was it that made him unshakable? What did he see that others could not? What did he understand that removed fear completely? This story is not just something to hear, it's something to confront. Because the same truth that carried John through fire still exists, still speaks, still challenges everything we think we know about control, fear, and what truly holds power. So the question remains, what do you believe when everything you trust is shaken? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video, because there are more stories like this waiting to be uncovered. And the next one might challenge you even more. Don't miss it. Stay curious, stay aware, stay watching.